We're all here. Hi, welcome and thank you for joining Save Ellis Island for this evening's event with Dr. Ronald Bayor. My name is John McGinnis. I'm the Vice President of Project Management Planning at Save Ellis Island. We're excited to have Dr. Bayor joining us tonight for a discussion on his book, Encountering Ellis Island, How European Immigrants Entered America. Also joining the conversation tonight is Lori Conway. Lori is an independent producer and filmmaker and author. She spent 2 years filming the abandoned Ellis Island complex. I actually worked there for her film Forgotten Ellis Island, The Extraordinary Story of America's Immigrant Hospital, and wrote the book of the same name. If you have questions for Dr. Bayor, please type them in chat. We'll be taking questions from our audience late in the program. And tonight, as a lucky guest in this event, we'll win a copy of Dr. Bayor's book. Stay tuned to the end when we announce the winner. Welcome, Ron and Lori.
Welcome, John.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. To begin our discussion, Dr. Bayor, I first of all want to say I enjoyed reading Encountering Ellis Island.
Thank you.
Certainly, it's a labor of love for me, this topic, but it enlightened me all the more about the experience of immigrating through Ellis Island. So to begin our discussion, you are a well-known scholar on this topic, but you're also the grandson of grandparents who came through Ellis. So to start, how about if we start with your Ellis Island story? Where did your grandparents come from? And what years did they come through? And why did they seek citizenship in America?
Okay, all four grandparents came through Ellis Island. They came in the early part of the 20th century, 1903, 1906, around that period. And all of them came from Poland, although one of them, my maternal grandmother, came from an area in Austria-Hungary, which then became Poland, which is now in Ukraine. So boundary shift. They all came over for basically the same reason, for a better life, because of the anti-Semitic pogroms and actions in Poland, and especially the part of Poland that was under Russian control, the Pale Settlement. And they were looking for a better life. And luckily, most of the family came. There were a few who left behind, and of course, they disappeared in the Holocaust. But thankfully, my grandparents came over. You see a picture here of my paternal grandparents, Samuel and Kate Banishevitz, and they came from Warsaw. They stopped in England on the way over, and this is a picture taken at a photography studio in England, which illustrates how they dressed up people to take photographs during that time. And they stopped in England because my grandmother was pregnant, and she gave birth to my aunt in England, and she brought the baby over with her to Ellis Island. Let me mention also the name. Banishevitz was the family name, and it wasn't changed until the 1930s, and partly because of the rise in anti-Semitism during the 1930s, even in New York, and they all wound up in New York. Basically, they were interested in assimilating as quick as possible, learning English, becoming American citizens. That was very important to them. So they were all on board to become Americans right away.
So how about if you describe the process of landing at Ellis and what the immigrants, like your grandparents, went through before they were admitted as citizens? They took their first steps on the island, but that was the first steps in a very long process. In fact, one immigrant quote from your book, the immigrant said, "The day I spent on Ellis Island was an eternity." And that says a lot, right?
Yes. Let me first say something about the trip over, which was not pleasant. They were not arriving on a cruise line. They were in steerage. Steerage was a terrible part of the bottom of the boat. Rose Vetrone, arriving in 1924 from Italy, when she was 23, said it took 9 days to sail to America, and 9 days I was sick. 9 days I didn't eat nothing. I was sick every single day. Mary Zuck, arriving in 1912, said it was so rough. Oh God, it was so rough. I didn't see a thing. A lot of time you just lay in your bed when you don't feel so good. You don't get up and go, because if you do get up, you get dizzy, and then it gets worse. Oh, the waves. I thought the ship was going to turn over. More than one said they wish they were back home. They're sorry they made the trip. It was horrible. Now, when they saw the Statue of Liberty. That was a revelation for them and exciting. Arnold Weiss, a Jewish immigrant from Poland, 1921, said, "Seeing the Statue of Liberty was the greatest thing I ever seen. It was really something. What a wonderful sight to know you're in this country." Sarah Asher remembered that the statue was beautiful with the early morning light. Everybody was crying. The whole boat bent towards her because everybody went out. Everybody was in the same spot. Angelina Pamilero, who made the crossing at age 10 in 1923, added, and somebody yelled, "The Statue of Liberty, the Statue of Liberty." We all ran to the railing to see, and everybody was praying and kissing and happy that we were coming up the Hudson. Basically, people were very excited. They actually felt they were in America at that point, but they weren't. There was a whole process to go.
And let me just interrupt, Karen, we could see some of those images now. Yeah, after this one, yeah.
Okay. From the boat, which docked either in Hoboken or New York, they had to get on a barge or a ferry to take them actually to the island. So they were not through with being on the water. Here's one, Edward Corsi, our immigrant who later became superintendent of immigration at Ellis Island. His statement was, "My first impression of the New World will always remain etched in my memory, particularly that hazy October morning when I first saw Ellis Island. The steamer Florida, 14 days out of Naples, filled to capacity with 1,600 natives of Italy, had weathered one of the worst storms in our captain's memory. And glad we were, both children and grown-ups, to leave the open sea and come at last through the Narrows into the bay. My mother, my stepfather, my brother Giuseppe, and two sisters, all of us together, happy that we would come through the storm safely, clustered on the foredeck for fear of separation, and look with wonder on this miraculous land of our dreams. Passengers all about us crowded against the rail, jabbered conversation, sharp cries, laughs and cheers. A steadily rising din filled the air. Mothers and fathers lifted up their babies so they could see. Off to the left, the Statue of Liberty. I looked at the statue with a sense of bewilderment, half doubting its reality. Many older persons among us, burdened with 1,000 memories of what they had left behind, have been openly weeping.
It was by no means an easy trip. It was by no means an easy process to come stand on Ellis, feel you're in America, and yet the work ahead of the immigrants was clearly a challenge for them.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I want to add one little thing. According to Manny Steen, who immigrated from Ireland in 1925 at age 19, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe were sometimes tricked by captains who dumped a load of the refugees on the east coast of Scotland during the night in a little seaport. They just dumped them off and said, "This is America," and they took off. The people thought they were in America because they couldn't speak any English anyway. So that's how immigrants wind up in other places as well, which was a strange story for me. I never knew that before I started my research.
So maybe we can go through these other images. I don't know if we have the capacity to do the streaming of these other images up there. But I was going to ask Ron, there's almost a mythical feeling one gets when reading about and visiting Ellis Island. Yet the research defies that it was anything but a perfect place, right? Where everything went smoothly. Talk about that other side of the Ellis Island story.
Okay, you have all these people waiting for the process to start. They really knew nothing about what was going to happen to them. They were tagged as they got off the barges, name, where they came from, where they were going, if they had relatives waiting for them, if they had any money. So as they entered the immigration process itself, just to give you one case, Louis Adamic, arriving in 1913, said that rumors were current among immigrants of several nationalities that some of us would be refused admittance into the United States and sent back to Europe. This was a very definite fear. For several hours, I was in a cold sweat on this account, although as far as I knew, all my papers were in order. Then he started worrying about catching some disease. I had heard about the several hundred sick immigrants who quarantined on the island. Stephen Graham, arriving from England in 1913, said, "It was the hardest day since leaving Europe and home. We were driven in herds from one place to another, ranged into single files, passed and reviewed before doctors, poked in the eyes by the eye inspectors, cross-questioned by the pocket inspectors, vice detectives, blue book compilers." For others, it was a worse experience. Dolcani Papadreas, arriving in 1919 at age 15, was terrified as she waited for the examination, facing a public health service doctor in military uniform. And that was by itself scary, because they were very afraid these were actually soldiers. And given their old world experience with soldiers, of course, and with military officials. Next to me was an Italian woman with 3 children, and one of the children was sick. The child was coughing. The mother was holding the child and singing. All of a sudden, the doctor and 2 nurses took the child away. The mother couldn't speak English, and they weren't talking to her, and they were talking to her in English. They were saying the child had to go to the hospital, and they took the child from her arms, and the mother was crying, not understanding anything that was happening.
So children, and as I learned in my research on the hospital, children were separated from their families. They had to be,
Yes.
because they had threatening contagious disease possibly, and we didn't have antibiotics to get rid of those diseases. So the separation was early and often. So this caused great stress amongst the immigrants. And they, as somebody said to me, if they weren't fearing deportation themselves, they knew somebody who had been deported. So there was that concern always present that their child could be deported, which would make break up the family. Their uncle could be deported. So there was fear amongst the hope and opportunity that was beckoning, right?
Absolutely. They were very fearful what to do if a child was in the hospital or was going to be deported. Would the whole family stay, or would they go? Would one person go back with the child? They just didn't know what to do. They never expected that. Mm-hmm. And especially for the ones who were detained or hospitalized for trachoma, mm-hmm. which was an eye disease they had never heard of. They felt healthy. They didn't know what was going on. And a lot of them were just in shock.
And you talk a little bit about the role of the immigrant aid societies that began in New York City at the time because of the 12 million people from around the world landing there, and the role of these immigrant aid societies in helping the immigrants who were both in the hospital or just being held for legal reasons, and what they did to help them get through.
Okay, if somebody was hospitalized, either the shipping companies paid for the hospitalization because they didn't want to pay for the person to go back, and they had to otherwise, or the immigrant paid, or the aid societies paid. And the aid societies were very important in a few areas. Paying for the hospitals, defending the immigrants at special inquiry sessions in which they were making appeals for why they should stay in the United States, and helping them in the confusion of the great registry room, telling them what to do. HIAS was one of them, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. There was one for Italians, there was one for Poles, there was one for Germans, and they were able to speak the language. Oh, not only that, they were able to help the immigrants find places to live and jobs. They were crucial in terms of getting them settled. Now, the most important thing that immigrants could do, if they were healthy, the other thing that really was a problem was if they might become a public charge. If somewhere along the line, they would be in need of a private or public charity. And that put them in trouble right away. Immigrants were on probation for 3 years. They could be deported within those 3 years. So within those 3 years, they had to make sure they had a job, and they had to make sure they didn't go any place that sounded like a charity, because otherwise they'd be deported. So the immigrant aid societies were very important in terms of preventing that from happening. Only 2% of Ellis Island people were actually deported. So this is a pretty good number.
And why was that? Why don't you explain the dynamic between the industrial age occurring at that time and the acceptance of immigrants?
Okay. America needed workers, period. And in the same way that during the progressive period, the government began to regulate railroads and banks and so on, they began to regulate immigration. Ellis Island opened in 1892. So what they were looking for were immigrants who could come into this country and get a job immediately. Sort of a cog in the industrial machine. They did not want sickly people. They did not want people who didn't have a skill. There were people who were rejected for poor physique, even though that was not an actual requirement, but people who looked like they couldn't do hard work were rejected, even if they had a skill. So also rejected were people who were considered contract laborers. If you came over and the immigration inspector asked, do you have a job here? And if you said yes, you could be deported, because the labor unions were very concerned with immigrants competing with people who were already here. And so they didn't want anybody coming over who actually had a job here. The thing you were supposed to say was that, oh, one of my relatives will get me a job, I have some good prospects. That was the right answer, but it was a trick question. And a lot of people were caught in it. But basically, we needed workers. And that was the goal of letting these people in who were not otherwise wanted in many other ways.
Perhaps that's the reason that today there is also a mythical quality to the Ellis Island immigrants. In my research, producing the film and the book on Forgotten Ellis Island, I hear a lot of, on the Facebook page, a lot of the people visiting the page saying, well, the Ellis immigrants were legal. They were the good immigrants. They did they came in the way they should. Your thoughts on that lasting impression of Ellis immigrants and their comparison to the illegal or bad immigrants of today?
Okay, first of all, there were a number of illegals. They came in by bribing people. They came in as part of the crew of a ship and they just slipped into the country. They came over in ports that were easy to get through, like coming over the border in Canada. So there were illegals during that time. The thing is, there was no such thing as an undocumented immigrant. Prior to 1855, the states controlled immigration and they were very lax. Basically, you arrived and you were here. That was it. They were concerned about sickness and they did quarantine some ships that came in at that time. But after 1892, what did it mean to be undocumented? Well, basically, you went through the process at Ellis Island and you were legally let in. In other words, you passed all the tests, you passed the medical test, you passed the inspector test, and you were let in. But there were slips there. There was bribery of immigrant inspectors. There were bribery of doctors. There was one person who was marked with an X on her coat, which meant a mental problem. And the inspector told her husband to wipe off the X and just go through it. So a lot of people slipped in anyway. Now, Mexican immigrants, Latin American immigrants were freely allowed to enter this country until 1965. That's the first time numerical quota was put on Mexican and other Latin American immigrants. Other than that, agribusinesses in this country pushed for Mexican immigrants to come in. We needed them in the Southwest, and they had a very easy time coming into the country. So that was not a problem. It was not anything like today.
And, why do you still think, though, that these immigrants the Ellis immigrants have this mythical quality to them as being the good immigrants versus?
Well, because that's who we are. About 40% of Americans can trace their lineage to Ellis Island. So, of course, our grandparents were wonderful and they did all the right things. And we helped America thrive. And so we're products of that. But very clearly, the Mexican immigrants did the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so will the ones who are coming over today and asking for asylum. They are coming for the exact same reason our grandparents came. Absolutely. And they are looking for jobs. They're looking for freedom, a better way of life for their children. They're here for the same reasons. And unlike what Trump said about rapists and so on coming across the border, that's totally untrue. Totally.
I want to shift a little bit to the fact that eventually the nativism of the time when Ellis was accepting high rates of Southern Europeans who were considered the non-preferred immigrant as opposed to the Northern European, eugenics, that pseudoscience, that
Yes.
the theory that America's gene pool now was being negatively impacted by the arrival of so many new citizens, especially those with darker skin from Southern and Eastern Europe. This pseudoscience played a powerful role in immigration laws that were becoming increasingly restrictive. Can you explain a little bit about why eugenics, this pseudoscience was so influential? And is there an equivalent today, say, in pairing immigrants with disease, as we have this immigrants with criminality, right? As we have this ongoing debate as a nation of immigrants, that the Ellis Island immigrants were good, the newcomers today are bad, right?
Okay.
The debate continues.
First of all, this great replacement theory, this bogus replacement theory that's floating around today, really can take us back to the 1820s and 30s when Irish Catholics were coming to the country, and we were going to be swarmed by Irish Catholics. It was going to change the Protestant nature of the country, and there's a lot of hostility towards that. So fast forward to the Eastern and Southern Europeans, Southern Italians, Eastern European Jews. This was the focus of the eugenics argument. The sense was that they were of an inferior ethnic stock, racial stock, because race and nationality were combined into one concept at that time. So Jews coming over, Southern Italians coming over, were going to dilute the Anglo-Saxon strong gene pool, they spoke of gene pools, of that time. And we would wind up with a much weakened country in that sense. This feeling was coming mainly from the Anglo-Saxon population in the United States, who did not want these new immigrants here and looked for any way to keep them out. The doctors were in on this too. Doctors were convinced that the new immigrants were unfit and nothing like the Northern Europeans. There was even one doctor who claimed that he was going to find a missing link between humans and apes among the immigrants. And even Calvin Coolidge, before he became president, spoke about these unfit people coming into the country and marrying with good American stock. One doctor said he expected to find an immigrant with a tail at some point because they were a degenerate bunch of people, more animalistic than anything. And in that case, eugenics, the pseudoscience popped up, pushed by people like Madison Grant, who wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race. And that book probably would be very much accepted today by some of the nativists, but it was very much that thing. They are replacing us. We don't want these people here. They don't know how to become American citizens. They come from countries that know nothing about democracy. And plus, they're sickly, they're degenerates, they're going to spoil the genetic pool. So that was all it. And of course, Jews were accused of bringing tuberculosis into the country. Italians, of course, were hit with the crime thing, as they have so often. And so that was of great concern. Now, nowadays, of course, Haitians were accused of bringing AIDS to the United States, and Mexicans were accused of bringing other diseases or drugs into the country. All untrue, but it's very typical when you're looking at people who you don't quite consider human beings to tag them with something that's going to diminish their ability to become real American citizens. Most people whose grandparents came from Ellis Island know nothing about that. And I've been surprised when I've seen some of these nativist groups today, and I see Italian names among them, or Polish names. I say, God, don't you know where you came from?
Right, right. What your grandparents went through. Right,
Yeah.
right. So true. And the debate continues, right, with the
Yeah,
same
yes,
argument. Yeah.
it sure does. Absolutely.
So let's look a little west. In the book, you describe conditions on on Angel Island
Yes.
in San Francisco Bay, where restrictions against the Chinese immigrants coming to America were far stricter than those focused on the European immigrants landing at Ellis. Explain the roots of that difference of opinion and truly laws that disallowed the Chinese to come through. And how did the medical and immigration inspection at Angel differ from Ellis?
Okay. Laws were never set against the Europeans. There were requirements, but the Chinese were excluded with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and which was repassed in 92 and 1902 and so on. We did not want Asians in this country. There was already a very strong anti-Asian attitude on the West Coast. There were already what I would call Asian pogroms on the West Coast. And basically, the sense was Asians could never become, especially Chinese, could never become real American citizens because they didn't fit in at all. When European immigrants went through the process at Ellis Island, they went through a process of walking past the doctors, and doctors would watch their gait, whether they were limping, whether they looked funny in some way, not quite all there, and they would pass by various doctors. The doctors at Angel Island said they couldn't do this because the Chinese were too inscrutable, which is another stereotype. And they said for the Chinese to be admitted, they had to strip completely and had to go through a full physical, even to the point of leaving a stool sample, which never happened to the Europeans. And the sense was that the Chinese and the Japanese and others were coming in with tremendous parasitic diseases, and therefore they would immediately pollute the nation. So they went through a very hard time of getting through. The point is, Ellis Island was hard on the immigrants, but basically we wanted them to come through. We needed their workers. On Angel Island, we did not want the Chinese to get through. We wanted them to be deported. We tried hard to get them deported. And if they weren't citizens of this country, and even then they had a hard time, or what were then called paper sons, which they claimed they were children of citizens and therefore allowed in, they had a very hard time getting into the country. It was a whole different attitude towards the Chinese. And Angel Island was not set up in the same way as Ellis Island. The Chinese, the Japanese, and the Europeans were separated at Angel Island into different dorms, different holding areas. They were not allowed to meet with each other. That never happened at Ellis Island. People mixed. Ellis Island was really what America was going to become. Angel Island was totally different in attitude towards these immigrants.
And when I think of Ellis, I think of us. This is us, right? Looking at the future of America. When we look at those archive photos of the immigrants at Ellis, we're looking back at us. You know,
that's right.
They're who we become, fortunately. So although the deportation from Ellis, back on Ellis here, and actually Angel as well, the deportation rates were certainly higher at Angel, but lower at Ellis. But nonetheless, it was a catastrophic decision imposed on families and couples and individuals. What was that experience like for them and their families?
If one was deported, well, if somebody was pulled off the line, for example, they were not told why they were being pulled off the process line, and they were usually put into detention. Detention would be a cage, either on the roof or in the registry hall, or they'd be taken to another room and be examined a little more. And you didn't know what was happening to you. The family didn't know why you were taken off the line. And so that was a very traumatic experience. Would they ever see their child again? Would they ever see their mother again? And so that was very traumatic for them to go through. Detention itself was very difficult. Detainees were herded into these rooms that were made for 200 to 400 people, and they crowded 1,000 people into them. And you were elbow to elbow. It was not sanitary. The toilets weren't working. They were not treated well by the guards during this time. And they waited there until one or two things happened. Either they went to the Board of Special Inquiry where they appealed their detention, or they were on their way back. And so that was, they just didn't know what was happening. The language problem was difficult. Of course, there were interpreters at Ellis Island, but they tried their best. And let me just read you one thing I thought was kind of
And from what I understood, there were so many dialects that, you know, you could be speaking Italian, but it may not have been still understandable to you.
Well,
or Hungarian, or the dialects were different amongst the translators. So they did, like you said, they did the best they could.
They did the best they could, but it was difficult to reach everybody. There was one interesting thing I wanted to read. This Theodore LaGuardia was an interpreter at Ellis Island.
Yes.
Later become mayor, of course.
Future mayor of New York City.
Yes, yes. LaGuardia said, "I always suffered greatly when I was assigned to interpret for mental cases in Ellis Island Hospital. I felt then that over 50% of the deportations for alleged mental disease were unjustified. Many of those classified as mental cases were so classified because of ignorance on the part of the immigrants or the doctors, and the inability of doctors to understand the particular immigrant's norm or standard." He mentions one particular case that was very sad. A young girl in her teens from the mountains of northern Italy turned up on Ellis Island. No one understood her particular dialect very well. And because of her hesitancy in replying to questions she didn't understand, she was sent to the hospital for observation. I could imagine the effect on this girl, who had always been carefully sheltered and had never been permitted to be in the company of a man alone. When a doctor suddenly tapped her on the knees, looked into her eyes, turned her on her back, and tickled her spine to ascertain her reflexes, the child rebelled. And how? It was the cruelest case I ever witnessed on the island. In 2 weeks' time, the child was a raving maniac, although she had been sound and normal when she arrived at Ellis Island. And that's a pretty sad story.
Yeah, and when you consider her parents then would have been homeless going back with her, or one of the parents going or taking her back, there would have been no home to go back to. And that situation continues today in this country of a nation of immigrants. And that brings me to my next question, which that popular saying, "America beckons, but Americans repel," was written in the 1920s, and 100 years later, it could be uttered today and everyone understands it. Why does that dynamic continue, although we are a nation of immigrants?
It's a funny attitude, because when one group gets in, they turn their back on the group coming after them. We're here, everything's great, we don't want you. You're gonna mess things up. And that happens all the time. It happened in regard to the immigrants coming in the 1820s and 30s, when the Eastern European Jews and Italians came over. Even happened when the German Jews came over in the 1840s, and they were very unhappy with the Eastern European Jews coming over because it would spoil their place in America. So yes, America beckons, but then not sure they want this new group in. Is this new group going to be as good as the old group? Well, how different are they? Especially with the Mexicans, it's really an odd attitude, since part of the United States was once part of Mexico, and we took part of Mexico, and these people became U.S. citizens. So it was a really foolish attitude to have. But the more different you were from whoever was living here at the time, the more hostility you faced.
So lastly, before we go to some questions from the audience, if there are any, what were some surprises that you might have encountered in researching and writing the book?
Well, I was surprised at the attitude of the doctors. They weren't always fair. And I was surprised at the inadequacies of the mental tests in terms of trying to figure out what these immigrants were saying. There was one interesting case. they asked this Irish immigrant, if I gave you 2 dogs and took away 1 dog, how many dogs would you have? He said 2. He said, no, let me try again. If I gave you 2 dogs, took away 1 dog, how many dogs would you have? 2. And they said, how could that be? Well, I have a dog at home. That makes 2. So the immigrants didn't understand it, and the inspectors didn't understand what was being said.
Cultural differences, yeah.
Yes, cultural differences
Exactly,
were clear.
Mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
There was another case in which they showed a picture to immigrants of a bunch of very well-dressed children, one of them holding flowers, and they're burying a rabbit, bunny.
Mhm.
And they asked immigrants to explain that. And immigrants, many of whom were peasants, couldn't imagine why anybody would feel sorry about burying a rabbit, let's say, rather than eating it, and why somebody would be holding flowers and looking sad at this scene. So again, cultural differences just split them right apart.
So the surprise was that. What about an understanding that you didn't have prior to writing the book that you do have now?
Well, I did understand the eugenics, but I didn't understand the part it would play with doctors. I thought they'd be a little smarter about that. And I didn't quite understand the many reasons why immigrants were rejected. The poor physique thing was very surprising.
Mhm.
And also the problems with the deaths at Ellis Island. People were taken to the hospital, not all of them survived.
Right.
And you had one poor fellow whose 2 children, 2 or 3 children were in the hospital, all of them died. The mother committed suicide. And when the man arrived at Ellis Island to pick up his family, he had no family. So there was a lot of sadness there. I mean, it was the Isle of Tears in many ways. So was Angel Island, even more so.
Yeah.
But I mean, the sorrow surprised me, because when you go to Ellis Island now, or when you hear stories from old people, or when I read the oral history, I use a lot of oral history, you really get the sense that they were so happy to be there. And of course, for some, you could get through Ellis Island in 5 hours, actually. For
Right.
some, it was wonderful.
It was
But
fun. Yeah.
if you were stopped, you were in trouble.
Mhm. Well, as one of my advisors on the film said to me, if you weren't sick when you got on the steamship boat in Germany or wherever, you were sick by the time you got off, possibly
Yes.
very sick, because of the lack of hygiene, as you mentioned, and the
Yes.
clean water and decent food. It just wasn't there for 2-3 weeks. And then
Well,
you're brought through as cattle into the Great Hall. Imagine the germs in the air in the Great Hall. And it was a very stressful situation. And yet they wanted to be here so much. Gave me newfound appreciation for their intrepid spirit. All my grandparents came through too. And you just think they didn't have it easy where they came from, but they knew they could possibly have it easier in America. And I think that prevails today, that sentiment. As difficult as the Mexicans, the southern border immigrants have getting through the horrible experience of the desert, they might have a better life here. And that's what I think the legacy of Ellis might teach us.
I agree totally.
Open our minds and our hearts a little bit, thinking that our grandparents didn't have it easy and they had a difficult time, and yet they did make our lives a bit, possible.
Yes. Well, as one of the immigrants who arrived recently from Nigeria, he said, immigrants aren't the problem. They want to be here. They want to be Americans. This is their golden land.
Yeah.
Even if they believed the streets were paved with gold and they were disappointed, this was the place they wanted to be.
Yeah.
We need these people.
Yeah. So here we do have some questions.
Okay.
Lanzarote to everyone. My Nana always talked about her fear of being sent back because of an eye disease. I don't remember her ever smiling, and talked little about her immigration from Torino. She was never allowed to speak Italian at all, and grandparents came from Italy. So that's similar to your story about your grandparents wanting to learn the language quickly. So talk a little bit about that need, that desire to become American quickly.
Okay. Well, for example, my mother, the daughter of immigrants, she was not allowed to speak Yiddish in the house. She was only allowed to speak English. They wanted her to become an American. This was the goal. And the sense was that you come to a new country, let's forget about the old world. And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of them didn't speak about the old world very much. They were here, a new life, a new beginning. Let's learn English. Let's send my kids to the public schools, and let's begin to assimilate. Assimilation was a very big goal of these people.
And then the comment about her Nana's fear of being sent back because of trachoma, the eye disease.
Yes.
And she said she never remembers her smiling, and talked little about her immigration from Torino. So Ellis, obviously, that trip over in Ellis had an indelible negative impact on her.
Sure.
And talk a little bit about that exam of the eye, which was very unpleasant.
They would walk along, and suddenly they'd been met by this fellow in military uniform, at least I thought. And suddenly he would take a little button hook and flip up the eyelid to look under the eyelid and to see if there was any disease. And they didn't know what was happening, but they feared that guy because they knew that if they would know they had a disease, but he would know. And immediately they'd be in trouble because trachoma could not be necessarily cured at that time. It can be now.
Very contagious as well.
And contagious. Yeah. So they were in big trouble with trachoma. And they said, as I mentioned before, they never heard of this disease. They felt healthy. And all of a sudden they were on their way to detention and maybe deportation. So they were very afraid of that. I mean, that spread fast around the immigrant ranks, that was something to be very afraid of.
And I learned through some of the oral histories from immigrants who underwent treatment at Ellis Island for the eye disease, trachoma. It was very painful. Yes. They would strap you down, and a orderly would hold your legs, because your response would be to fight back against the pain of a blue stone. There's some kind of sulfuric acid that they would rub under the eyelid, which would kill it was an infection, and we didn't have antibiotics. So this was the only thing they knew that could eventually burn the skin off. And then you would get rid of the infection by burning the infected skin off.
Creating scar tissue, that's what they were trying to do, right?
And eventually those little spots, it was like little pimples underneath your eyelid, and that would cause the infection to get worse, and you could lead to blindness. So you said yes to the treatment, although it was horrendous. It was very painful. And there was also concern if you were blind, of course, you were going to become a public charge. And that's where the doctors and nurses would often plead for the aid societies to tell the families, let everybody know you're going to support this person, even if they're blind, you'll take care of them. They won't depend on the government for welfare. They'll be able to be supported in the family. So it was a really difficult disease to handle, and many people were deported for that.
They were, because a lot of cases it couldn't be cured, and they were sent back.
Yes, so long. Yeah. Any more? Let's see. Do we have any other questions here? Okay. Anyone who has traveled to a foreign country and doesn't speak that language can experience in a very small way what these poor folks experienced after a long and debilitating voyage. We don't view the military with their weapons in the foreign airports. Here, the doctors were in military uniform. Do you know why the doctors were attired in this way as U.S. Public Health Service doctors?
Yeah, they were part of the U.S. Health Service.
Yeah.
They were officers in the U.S. Health Service. They wore the military uniform of the U.S. Health Service, of the Public Health Service. They were not in the Army, but they looked like they might be. Mm-hmm. So anybody in a military uniform was somebody to be afraid of. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they all wore the military uniform.
Now, what about the nurses? Were they U.S. Public Health Service nurses?
They were U.S. Public Health Service nurses. They did not wear any uniform.
They didn't. They had the white.
Yeah. And by the way, there was no woman doctor at Ellis Island until 1913. And that caused some problems.
Dr. Beth?
I don't remember.
Yeah,
who it was.
Rojab or one of, so yeah, it was a long time before
Yeah.
women there was so much fear. They'd never shown their bodies to anybody but
Well,
their husbands. And here
Privacy
they were.
was a big issue.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of challenges out there.
Yes.
How did the doctors disinfect the button hooks or other medical equipment between exams?
They didn't.
Mm.
And they didn't disinfect anything as you moved along the line. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt went there one time to look at what was going on. He was disgusted at what they were doing and the lack of cleanliness and sanitary habits, because that was doctoring back then. They weren't really very aware of germs and disinfectants. And so, yeah, you could pick up something very easily just going through the line.
There's no gloves then, no masks.
Yes, they used gloves. They did do it, but they didn't change the gloves.
Right. It's amazing that there was never, from what I learned, an epidemic traced to an immigrant group that came through Ellis, which to me seems miraculous.
There was one group that they found typhoid on the ship after the group had left the ship. And the immigration services went out and found every one of those persons, dragged them out of their homes in some cases, and put them into a hospital.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. Some of them were dragged out screaming that there was nothing wrong, but they were typhoid carriers, or at least they were suspected to be typhoid carriers.
Right. Yeah. They did a lot with a little when you think about it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it worked in a good sense. That a lot of people got through. Right. It worked like a conveyor belt. It was industrialized immigration, but most of them got through. I mean, they had some bad memories, but of course, those went away, I guess, eventually. They just didn't talk about it. And they were in New York. They were in America.
So, last question here. From what I hear, there's a record number of people from around the world are now hoping to visit Ellis Island again. The draw is still there. Yeah. Why is that?
It's our Plymouth Rock for those whose grandparents came through there. It's where we begin. It's the Mayflower. I mean, I could go see Plymouth Rock and it would mean, well, that's a nice part of U.S. history, but Ellis Island is my history. So that's the way I feel about it. I have much more emotions going through Ellis Island. And to know my grandparents went through this. They were here. They went through all this. That's very important to me.
Well, may it continue. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
John, I think you're going to pick it up from here with our raffle for the book. Let's see. Hold on here. Hello. Let's see, John.
Hi.
Here he is. Thank you, John.
Keyboard was not working. Sorry, I was a little bit delayed. My keyboard was not working, but just want to thank you both, Ron and Lori, for participating in this evening's event. And I do want to announce our winner to tonight's contest. The winner is Phyllis Gardner. Congratulations, Phyllis. All you need to do, Phyllis, is email your address to info@saveellisisland.org. Again, that's info@saveellisisland.org. Join us for our next event on Tuesday, June 21st, 2022 at 7 p.m. with Dr. Gillum. David Gillum will be with us in the discussion of his book, Shadows of Berlin. Visit us on our website at saveellisisland.org to become a member. Learn more about the restoration work being done, ways you can donate to help save this national icon and preserve our history for future generations. Guided tours of the abandoned hospital complex in Ellis Island are available daily. Check our website for details. Thanks for joining us today and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ron. It was a pleasure. Hope we meet up one of these days.
Yes,
Thank
definitely.
You.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.